It was December 31st, 1999, when Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first president after the end of the Soviet Union, resigned due to health problems and extremely low popularity ratings. Vladimir Putin, who at the time held the position of prime minister, officially assumed the presidency of the country for the first time, but definitely not for the last. Since then, Putin has transformed Russia into a sort of autocracy, invaded two of its neighboring countries and former members of the defunct Soviet Union, and strengthened ties with countries like Syria and Iran, positioning himself against the advance of American influence. A former agent of the KGB, the feared Soviet intelligence service that existed from 1954 to 1991, Putin is a lawyer by training but worked as a spy for the intelligence agency for over 15 years. With a style of governance that more resembles a blend of the absolutism of old Russian imperial families and the relentless Soviet propaganda machine, Putin has been described by many as the czar of the 21st century, ruling a country that is anything but democratic, controlling the population with an iron fist in a country where the press is almost entirely in the hands of a group of oligarchs who maintain close ties with him. Putin represses and overruns anyone who criticizes his government or threatens his stay in power, including the oligarchs themselves. More than 20 years have passed since Yeltsin's fateful resignation in 1999, yet Putin remains in power. Since then, the United States has been governed by 4 different presidents, while Russia continues under Putin's orders. Once in power, he has relied on successive maneuvers to stay there for as long as possible, which continues to happen to this day. Through a policy involving manipulation, repression, and a powerful group of allies, Putin might spend more time in power than Stalin himself. Putin's rise coincides with the fall of Boris Yeltsin's figure. But to understand how Putin really came to power and how he might stay there until 2036, we need to rewind and understand his history, along with the reasons that led to the chaos that followed the end of the Soviet Union and the events that culminated in Yeltsin's resignation. Putin was born in October 1952 in the former Soviet city of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg, 7 years after the end of World War II. Both his father and mother, a working-class couple, survived the horrors of World War II, especially the terror inflicted by the Nazis. World War II left the Soviet Union devastated. After invading countries like Austria and Poland, Hitler authorized the invasion of the Soviet Union, which until then was neutral in the conflict. This forced the bloc to practically join the war waged by the Germans, leading to a series of bloody battles between Germans and Soviets. Alongside France, England, and the United States, the Soviet Union was part of the Allies. The group of countries that together fought and defeated the Axis comprised of Germany, Italy, and Japan. His father, Vladimir Putin, was a war veteran who survived World War II. He was one of the few from his unit to return home alive, though he lived the rest of his life with injuries from shrapnel. Putin recounts in one of his books that his father had his legs blown off by a suicide attack during a mission in World War II. His mother survived the terrible siege of Leningrad, part of the so-called Operation Barbarossa, aimed at invading the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. Even though both countries had signed a non-aggression pact a few years earlier, the siege of Leningrad is known as one of the cruelest and bloodiest episodes in history. Completely ignoring the agreement made between Germany and the Soviet Union 2 years prior, Hitler authorized the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Among the reasons the Nazis used to justify the invasion was the expansion of living space, a diabolical concept devised by the Nazis and used several times as justification for invading other countries throughout the course of World War II. In practice, Germany could not sustain the war it had started for much longer, and thus needed many of the resources present in the Soviet Union, like oil and minerals. Therefore, one of the targets of Operation Barbarossa was the city of Leningrad, where Putin's parents lived at the time. After a period of armed struggle, the German strategy changed, and the orders became to surround the city and prevent anything or anyone from entering or leaving. The objective was to starve the Soviets to death. For nearly 900 days, Leningrad was without access to food or treated water. A terrible, widespread famine set in. Adults could not eat more than 250 g of bread per day. The portion for children and the elderly was even smaller. Coupled with this, the harsh Russian winter contributed to those who did not die of hunger or thirst dying of cold. During the siege of Leningrad, from which Putin's mother survived, nearly 1 million people died as a direct or indirect consequence of Nazi actions. The desperation was such that, during this time, about 2,000 cases of cannibalism were recorded. In one of the books he wrote, Putin recounts that his mother fainted from hunger. People thought she had died and placed her body with the others when, finally, she woke up and, according to Putin, by some miracle, survived. Putin was the youngest of 3 siblings, 2 of whom died in childhood before he was born, And like most Soviet citizens of the time, he was born into a poor family and had a rather modest childhood without luxuries. Putin lived with his parents in a small room of a shared apartment. They didn't even have hot water or a decent bathroom. They used a bathroom near a broken and hole-covered staircase. As a pastime, he and his friends would torment the rats that lived in the stairs of their apartment building. During this time, Putin recounts learning a lesson about what can happen if you press your enemies too hard. He tells of once seeing a huge rat and chasing it down the corridor until finally cornering it. With nowhere to go, the rat jumped back at him. He recounts being surprised and scared because now it was the rat chasing him. His mother swept streets, cleaned lab equipment, and did other simple jobs in exchange for very small sums of money. During childhood, Putin was an extremely temperamental child. He often ignored school activities, threw erasers at his classmates, and constantly fought with his physical education teacher. Despite not being a good student at that time, he excelled in history and German. In 6th grade, his performance significantly improved, leading to him becoming an exemplary student during high school. So much so that he was accepted into a prestigious school and soon became an above-average student. From then on, his life would be marked by high achievement in almost everything he set out to do. With the end of the war in 1945, a new world order was born, with two superpowers that would dominate the global scene for the next 4 decades. On one side, the United States, on the other, the Soviet Union. This was the beginning of a new chapter in recent history that Putin would witness firsthand. With the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union rose to the status of the two greatest superpowers of the time, engaging in an ideological conflict known as the Cold War. Due to both countries also being the two greatest nuclear powers of the time, conflict by air, land, or sea became impossible, based on the principle of mutual annihilation, where in such a war, there would be no winner. Having been involved in many fights during his adolescence, Putin turned to sports. He began practicing Sambo, a combat sport developed by the Red Army in the 1920s, and became a black belt in judo. His passion for judo is so great that he even wrote an entire book on the subject, with the help of 2 other writers. After finishing school, Putin enrolled in law, graduating from what is now St. Petersburg State University. There, he met a figure who would completely change how he related to politics and define Russia's future at the turn of the century. Anatoly Sobchak was a professor of business law at the same university where Putin studied. The two met and developed a friendship that would leverage Putin's political career years later. It was right after university that Putin joined the KGB, the Soviet intelligence service that also acted as a secret police. His youth coincided with the zenith of the Soviet Union and the peak of the Cold War, marked by disputes in the fields of science and technology, as well as the arms race and the space race. During this period, intelligence agencies like the CIA and KGB had immense prestige, so it's no surprise that Putin's dream, like that of many Soviet youths at the time, was to join the KGB. The Committee for State Security, known by the acronym KGB, was the ruthless Soviet intelligence service. Its function was to secure the state's interests, whatever they might be. This included persecuting dissidents, surveilling the population, crushing opponents, and maintaining the government's image at all costs, often employing violent methods and undercover operations. The KGB was a practical example of the belief that the ends justify the means. Everything it did was orchestrated with the aim of maintaining an impeccable image of the Soviet government. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster was a clear example of this. The accident's causes were directly linked to flaws in the reactor design, but this was not taken into consideration. Moreover, the Soviet government tried to cover up the situation with the active participation of the KGB, even though the accident could have had serious implications for other European countries, like the contamination of waters supplying much of Europe. The accident was only brought to public attention when high levels of radiation were detected in Sweden. During its years of operation from 1954 to 1991, the KGB was responsible for espionage, both domestic and international arrests, kidnappings, bombings, assassinations, and much disinformation. At its peak, It was considered one of the most powerful organizations, deemed the world's largest secret police and espionage agency. The KGB had over 450,000 agents, and the Soviet Union might have used millions of people as informants over the years. Putin was a KGB agent from 1975 to 1991, where he worked as a spy for the Soviet government. He spent years in then East Germany, the eastern side of Germany controlled by the Soviet Union after World War II. However, his activities during this period are poorly documented, and it's not exactly known what he did at that time, but it's likely he worked in conjunction with criminal organizations, supplying weapons and other requested equipment. Putin was working in East Germany when he saw, firsthand, the Berlin Wall fall in 1989. It was the end of the Soviet Empire and the beginning of a new chapter in which Putin did not know, but would be one of the main characters. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union's economic situation was not going well at all. At the time, Mikhail Gorbachev took over, but his most famous policies, called perestroika and glasnost, did not succeed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down, one of the ultimate symbols of the Cold War, and Germany, divided between Americans and Soviets after World War II, was finally unified under a single government. With the Soviet Union in ruins, Gorbachev suffered an attempted coup. Around this time, Putin resigned from his position in the KGB and returned to his hometown, now called St. Petersburg. Soon after, Sobchak became mayor of St. Petersburg and made Putin his deputy. This move by Sobchak, a longtime friend, was what propelled Putin into politics. Gorbachev was the last leader of the Soviet Union, officially dissolved in December 1991 and broken up into 15 independent republics, one of which was the Russian Federation, where Boris Yeltsin would be elected the first president. Yeltsin was a charismatic politician who won public support and assumed the presidency of the Russian Federation when the Soviet Union ended. But he led a policy of rapprochement with the West, especially with the United States, which did not please everyone. Since the end of World War II, the United States had become the Soviets' nemesis, and this relationship would not change overnight. For decades, the Soviets distrusted the Americans, just as the Americans distrusted the Soviets. Initially, polls indicated a high approval rating for Yeltsin's government. But true chaos engulfed Russia with the end of the Soviet Union, and its economy, practically imploded during Gorbachev's years, combined with Yeltsin's government approval, which plummeted to just 6% by the end of his term, did not end well. Yeltsin's government sold thousands of state enterprises, which until then had been state-controlled, in an attempt to restructure the Russian economy. The privatization program launched in the mid-1990s was the largest wave of privatization in history, with about 800 companies sold per month. Most of these companies ended up in the hands of a small group of people known as Russian oligarchs. In a desperate attempt to boost his popularity, which was not going well, Yeltsin sold numerous state enterprises for next to nothing. And it was at this time that Putin became the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, known as Russia's crime capital. As deputy, he used his position to favor interest groups, earning their respect and sympathy. Soon, Putin became a favorite among the oligarchs and quickly rose to higher positions, eventually being appointed prime minister under Yeltsin's government. At the turn of 1999 to 2000, Yeltsin resigned, making Putin the new president of Russia. The turn of the millennium brought with it a series of changes, and this was one of them. Putin's arrival at the presidency would completely alter the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe in the following decades, although no one knew this at the time, not even Putin himself. In the year Putin assumed office, Chechen terrorists began pushing towards Russian territory borders, and in August 1999, a series of terrorist attacks on Russian civilian buildings killed over 300 people. Putin, as prime minister, blamed Chechen radicals for the attacks and started a war against Chechnya, which ended up being annexed to Russian territory. Later, it was discovered that the attacks were orchestrated by members of the FSB, the intelligence agency that replaced the KGB after the end of the Soviet Union, and that the attacks were described as training. However, These attacks dramatically increased Putin's popularity among voters, who until then saw him as just a new face in Russian politics. Putin's approval ratings surged from 2% before the attacks to 45% after them, and this surge was directly responsible for Putin's victory in the 2000 elections. From there, Putin began shaping Russia in his image, and corruption also became a hallmark of his government. Unlike Yeltsin, Putin subdued the oligarchs, rewarding those who stayed by his side and punishing those who decided to criticize him. Since the former state companies were sold for a pittance to Russian oligarchs, this group gained far more power and influence than they should have, including in politics, especially because they came to control a key aspect of society: the media. In power, Putin invaded Georgia, the Crimean Peninsula, and Ukraine. But taking power was not enough. He had to stay in it. According to the Russian Constitution, the president can only serve 2 consecutive terms. However, the same Constitution does not place a limit on the total number of terms a president can serve. Putin served from 2000 to 2004, and from 2004 to 2008. After that, he appointed Dmitry Medvedev as his successor. Medvedev won the elections and appointed Putin as his deputy, in a clear exchange of favors. Soon after, Putin ran for office again, winning by an impressive margin. After that, he managed to pass a law that could keep him in power until 2036, which might be longer than Stalin was in command of the Soviet Union. But apart from manipulating several levers to keep himself eligible for longer than he should, Putin uses 2 specific tactics to stay in power and make it seem like the people genuinely prefer him. Russia is considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists to work in. Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian officer and ex-FSB member, accused Putin's government of being extremely corrupt. He also accused the Russian government of orchestrating the murder of Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, and claimed that the Russians themselves had planned the bomb attacks against civilian apartments, among other terrorist acts, all efforts to propel Putin to power during the elections. He also accused Putin of ordering the assassination of Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya. Litvinenko coined the phrase mafia state to refer to Putin's Russia. He was poisoned with polonium in 2006 and died weeks later. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, former owner of Yukos, one of the world's largest oil companies and Russia's largest, once considered Russia's richest man, was arrested and sentenced to 14 years in prison on charges of corruption, fraud, tax evasion, and currency smuggling. Putin's government also suppresses any act against the government by civilians, which rarely happens, due to the alliances Putin maintains. Putin has made and kept several alliances throughout his political career that have helped him not only ascend but also maintain power. And this is particularly true when it comes to Russian oligarchs. Oligarchs benefited greatly from the wave of privatizations promoted by Yeltsin in the 1990s. This made them even more powerful, controlling even the media, which leads us to the second tactic: feeding the Russian propaganda machine. In addition to being a military machine, Russia is also a propaganda machine, just as the Soviet Union was. Practically all newspapers work in favor of the government, which means it's Putin's government that decides what goes on air about Putin's government. And in this case, Putin prefers to hide anything that might not be good for his image. Thus, he uses the media to manipulate public opinion and manage to stay in power without necessarily being considered a dictator. It's not like he forces people to vote for him. Instead, he leads them to the wrong conclusions that eventually lead them to vote for him. The Russian propaganda machine operates with the intent to keep Putin in power for as long as possible, altering people's perceptions of who he really is and what he actually does, both inside and outside Russia, something very similar to what Stalin did during his years ruling the Soviet Union. The Soviet propaganda machine was one of the largest and most efficient in the world, so much so that it led to a personality cult involving Stalin, something very similar to what happens today with Putin, albeit on different scales. Thus, Putin becomes an increasingly authoritarian, populist, and dangerous leader. Putin claims not to earn more than $140,000 per year, equivalent to less than $12,000 a month. and that he has an apartment of just over 70 square meters. His true wealth, however, remains an unsolved mystery, but there are some theories. For example, Putin's palace is a mansion on the Black Sea coast that is said to have been built by Russian oligarchs for the president's personal use. Moreover, some things are linked to Putin's friends and family, although never directly to him, like a super yacht worth about $100 million. But Putin leaves no traces, making it practically impossible to know clearly where all these things come from. But the fact is that one of the reasons Putin is interested in staying in power is because it allows him to maintain his lifestyle, which apparently includes a collection of luxury watches, a mansion worth nearly $1.5 million, plus planes, helicopters, cars, and yachts. Until the early 1990s, the name Vladimir Putin was almost completely unknown. Today, Putin is considered one of the world's most influential politicians, leading a country that relentlessly advances on its neighbors in an attempt to recover a supposed lost glory from the days of the great Soviet Empire. Putin is not very different from the tyrants who ruled pre-revolutionary Imperial Russia, nor from the revolutionaries who took power shortly after. His popularity within Russian territory can easily be attributed to the propaganda machine that the Russian media has become in recent decades. His life, like his passion for chess, seems marked by movements that are always very calculated and precise, with the aim of reaching a specific goal. His roots in the KGB certainly helped shape how he views European powers, and especially the United States, which apparently have never ceased to be his #1 enemy. Like someone still in service, Putin lives a life of devotion to the state, although at times it's unclear whether Putin lives for the state or if the state lives for Putin. He uses his position to achieve the most extravagant and devilish plans that come to his mind, not hesitating to step over everything and everyone to get what he wants. The question remains whether all this has been done to truly regain political glory, which it's uncertain whether the Soviet Union ever truly had, and to what extent it was a facade, or a personal glory that Putin seems desperately eager to achieve since his youth. What do you think of Putin and his intentions? And what did you think of this documentary? Leave your comments below. I want to know.